I'll rise in body or in spirit for the reading of the gospel. It comes to us this week from John, the first chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." The Gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end not could remove, is now 2 hours' traffic of our stage. The which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toils shall strive to mend. And you've now heard the two most famous prologues in the English language. Both Romeo and Juliet and John 1 were once something I had memorized, but no longer with Romeo and Juliet. It hasn't been as useful to me. John 1 has never stopped being useful to me. As a prologue, it's incredibly useful because it not only sets the stage for everything that will happen in John, it also gives the entire thesis of what John's about. And like Romeo and Juliet, it tells us what kind of narrative we should expect. John says right there from the beginning that the world will not know Jesus and that he will come to his own and he won't be recognized. And Romeo and Juliet tells us that, they're going to be offed by the end of the story. It also invites us in these two prologues to say the rest of what's going to happen here deserves your attention because it's going to make the rest of this make sense. Romeo and Juliet says at the end there, and if you didn't catch any of what I just said, the story will explain it. John's Gospel too, by the way, don't put too much on this prologue because it's not supposed to tell you everything. The Gospel is supposed to. You'll get the gist of all of it by listening to the teachings of Jesus found in John. Now, you will know, by the way, that all of the Gospels have a prologue, kind of. You might think that each of the Gospels is the same thing. It's the story of Jesus. But they're after really different things. I've got John committed to memory, but Matthew's Gospel is a genealogy of hundreds of people. And that one I do not have memorized. It goes from David to Jesus. And it's important because it shows that he is in line to inherit the throne of David, the title of Messiah. And for a Jewish audience who was new to this Jesus thing, that's a really good place to start. Indeed, it, I think, has been convincingly said that the rest of the Gospel of Matthew could be called a gospel of catechesis for Jewish people, that it might have even lined up with the Jewish calendar year, such that they would be practicing various rituals at times when you'd be doing a particular reading that was very apropos for that in Matthew. Mark was probably the first on the scene in terms of the Gospels, and he's the go gospel. It looks like he was first on the scene. He wants to get the message out about this as fast as possible. He is done in 1 chapter what Luke has done in 3. And indeed, you might even say it's hard to find where Mark's prologue is within all that, other than just he says, here we go. Now, Luke does, take his time. He says in his first words that this is a letter, that this is addressed to somebody. It's to a guy, and his name's Theophilus. Theophilus might be a guy. Actually, he might be not a guy. It might be, generally speaking, anyone who loves God. That's what Theo, God, Philus, lover, means. And then we've got John's Gospel, who it can be mystifying. Like I say, don't have this entire parable or this passage have to carry the weight of all the rest of what John is about to do. And also don't be put off by the Greek in all this, because there's a lot of really complicated Greek words in here that make it sound more like it's something from Socrates than the other Gospels. First of all, those other Gospels are actually equally complicated. They're trying to do equally complicated things, and they artfully manage to do those things. John's just talking to Greek people who probably have a little better Greek. Maybe they're Greeks. I mean, people speak Greek up and down the ancient world at this point in time. Even the Romans are speaking Greek. It's kind of the lingua franca. But this sort of language is just making a claim in that vernacular. And you do have to know some of the Greek words, but I'll tell you, there's not that many. In fact, actually, you know what? Let's do some of the Greek. If you want to know the first line of this, you only really need to know 3 Greek words. Arche, from like archaic, right? Old or beginning. Logos, which we'll talk more about in a second. And you already heard the third one, theon in this translation. You don't need to know the words in between. All the participles doesn't matter. In arche, in os logos, kai os logos, in pros ton theon, kai theon, in logos. And that's communicated and repeated throughout this number of times, but you'll note from the very beginning there that it sounds like Genesis. It equates this figure of the Word with Godhood, and Godhood with the Word, and that there is this interplay of togetherness with the two. So, logos, if we want to translate it, probably the word is one of the weakest things we could do. It's a nod, really, more than anything else, to its untranslatability, that you just have to choose any old word, and word was what we chose. It might be better if we look at some of the root of where that comes from. So prologue, for instance, the log part there is logos. So is logic. I guess a better way of saying it is, what if logos means meaning, or meaningfulness, or truth, big T truth, that anything is true at all, that there is purpose, that there is any purpose at all. Those would be fair ways of translating logos as well. You remember when we were looking at those pictures taken from the Hubble as we were beginning this gospel reading? That is the order of magnitude that word should command. And lest we have any delusions of grandeur about where we sit when we look at that, we are a speck. That's sometimes good news, by the way, because I will guarantee you that embarrassing thing that you said freshman year, that you're sure everybody still remembers, once the sun is finished with its expansion period and has actually grown to encompass all the inner planets, including Earth, which has been burned up and is now gone, then the final record of that embarrassing thing you say will be expunged from the universe, annihilated. However, also annihilated will be everything you were ever proud of, everything you ever did that held some meaning that you thought was really pretty cool. Both of those things at the same time are rendered insignificant. And that's, I don't know, every once in a while we need to hear that. We need to hear, yeah, you know what, in the grand scheme of things, not that bad. It's also not that good. That was a great shepherd's pie. I'm really glad that I got to do that for LifeBridge. But that's not what's going to be remembered about me, and it also probably hasn't single-handedly fixed homelessness. Now, John's gospel is not making that point, though. It's making the flip of that point. Because the argument is that if the Logos, which is with God and was from the beginning, when black holes were set out to spin galaxies together, when the rules of what is possible was written such that life itself had room to grow and flourish in it, that God took a personal interest in you, had something that he wanted to say to you, so he came down and took on flesh and lived a life with all the full consequences of what that meant, including death on a cross. But God chose that as a plan to become incarnate and to do that thing. What? I mean, if we were baffled by why seemingly insignificant beings, again, whose works will fade from memory eventually, why that God took a personal interest in us, then the pages after this prologue are going to take on a lot more heft, aren't they? You're going to want to hear, so why did this Jesus do that? I'm not going to tell you in this, but I'm going to tell you that at the end of John, there's an epilogue. Now, it's an embarrassing epilogue. What's embarrassing about it is that for Bible people, chapter 20 ends perfectly. It ends with this passage that says, after all the things that you know happened at the end of Jesus' life, including his resurrection, says, and Jesus did many more things in the presence of his disciples, more than could ever be written down here. But these were written so that you might come to believe. Chapter 21. What? Chapter 21? It's over. Why is there a chapter 21? It's an epilogue. And people have, I'm telling you, it's so embarrassing. These people Bible folks have gone into the oldest versions of John that they could possibly find, and every one of them has a chapter 21. And they've asked, well, it looks like they must have added this on, but we're wrong. The point is that John added this extra verse, this epilogue, to tease the sequel. You ever done that? Ever finish a book and you say, oh man, they wrapped everything up great, but there's an epilogue, and the epilogue just leaves a door open that you can see your favorite characters in action in the next installment of whatever book. The epilogue is about you. The epilogue is that you are now a part of this story. It's at Christmas time that we hear all these messages of joy and cheer, that because God of the universe took a personal interest in your life, and because meaning has now been re-entered into existence, that our actions have meaning, that our lives have consequence, that we are loved and are capable of living that way, that is the sequel to the story of Jesus. What happens in this epilogue? Well, it's a silly story. I mean, Jesus shows up. They don't recognize him. The disciples don't. They're fishing. He gives them fishing advice. It works. And Simon Peter immediately sees who it is. He swims to shore, embarrassingly, because he can't even wait for the boat to get back. And Jesus spends some time with his disciples. It's a really, really lovely scene. It's an intimate scene of people who just want to be together and miss one another and who are reunited with one another. And in that scene, Jesus forgives Peter for screwing up. He promises them that there's going to be hard times ahead, but that he's going to be with them through it all. And not only is that true, but then the Holy Spirit made it possible that they told others, and that joy, that Christmas cheer, became an infectious thing. More and more people found out that God made flesh and lived among us. And finally, it arrived at you. And what you might come to realize is it isn't just a word. It wasn't just a word that you heard, but it was an actual revelation, that it was an actual reality for you now, a new one, a new reality where things mattered. And that means that this incarnation was not contained to Palestine in the first century, that it was actually an incarnation that happens again and is meaningful for you now, when you embody that joy, when you live a life freed from everything that was hampering you. That is the good news of the gospel as laid out in this prologue. And it comes to its conclusion in its epilogue, and has now found its life in you, the sequel. May it continue to be passed down. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.